560 The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy mentioned Alex Karp earlier in the show. He was on CNBC yesterday hawking his new book, The Technological Revolution. He's the CEO of Palantir. He has spent half of his life in Germany, so it was interesting. And again, he previously described himself as a socialist. He voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So some of the comments that he offered yesterday are not terribly surprising for anybody who's followed him, but I think were even a little jarring for Aaron Ross Sorkin on the set of CNBC. Anyway, Karp talking about Germany and about what's happening in the West generally against the backdrop of that speech that J.D. Vance gave in Munich on Friday. This is good stuff. Take a listen. Very important insight here.
But the problem in Germany is that somehow the small portion of Germans that believe you cannot talk about migration without being a bigot, which is about probably 15%, 90% of them vote for the Green parties, have somehow tricked the larger parties into saying they will only vote for things if the far right doesn't vote with them, which basically, as a matter of pragmatic power, shifts all immigration policy to a small group of people that literally will not let you discuss the fact that Afghani immigrants to Germany have a 70x propensity compared to German population to commit certain kind of crimes. And that in the last couple of weeks, every single terror attack has been the result.
Did you go to jail for pointing that out?
You'll get into trouble, but this is the weird thing. Again, there's a lesson in this book, which is do not allow yourself to become a product of people you may tacitly agree with. So, I'm sympathetic with non-discrimination. I don't believe in discrimination across any variable. But you are being turned into a product by a certain small sector of the left because you're not allowed to talk about facts. Like in the last couple of weeks, term Alternative für Deutschland, 4 weeks ago, they're telling me yeah, screw it, I'm going to vote for them. And the reason why is it's our responsibility. And you see this, by the way. Why is the Democratic Party committing suicide? It's because
in the U.S. you're talking about.
In the U.S., it's the same thing. It's we're not allowed to admit, we're not allowed to do true false. Okay, I agree with this person, I don't agree with this person. We literally have to say anything that's ever been uttered from this person in the whole timeline has to be wrong, including border, defense, and this is happening in every Western country. And again, it's very similar to the question you asked. Okay, we know why they do it. The Greens and others are really smart to do this because then in the end, they define how the society's run. But none of us want that society. And it's not bigoted to say, wait a minute, this is not working.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how you can have a small group capture the parameters of debate, and thus, even though they're small in numbers, essentially they represent the ruling party philosophy. And now the flip side to that is to say, well, that may be an accurate description of what's happening, but that certainly doesn't provide any excuse for those who are too afraid to speak up to that vocal minority to do so. And to say, no, if something makes sense, I don't care who's saying it, I'm going to say it makes sense and act in that direction, rather than, no, if it's coming from, a source that we have so decreed as illegitimate, no matter what is offered, no matter what is said, Trump, in this case, in America, he's obviously referencing, then we're going to reject it out of hand. Well, that's the silliness that leads you down this path to where you're captive to a vocal, intolerant, histrionic, unglued minority, which is the story in the West. And we're going to see what the implications of that are in Germany in the not too distant future. And the illegal immigration problem or migrant problem there just gets more and more pronounced. And then you had this knife attack not far away in Austria where a 14-year-old boy was killed by a Syrian migrant. And that's just fueling this discussion even more. For commentary on this and other topics, please be joined by Cliff May, president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and foreign affairs columnist for the Washington Times. Cliff, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Dan and Amy, always good to be with you guys.
That's a pretty good synthesis of the politics, the dynamic of politics in the West, at least on the center left, isn't it?
I think it is. I think it's a good analysis of what's been happening both in the U.S. and in Europe, this idea of radical parties capturing the discourse and, if you will, closing the Overton window. The Overton window being the definition of what it is. What it is socially acceptable to discuss opinions. It is socially acceptable to have. Look, on immigration, I'm somebody who's in favor of immigration, but I'm in favor of legal immigration and not overwhelming immigration. When German Chancellor Angela Merkel suddenly, a few years ago, said, "Oh, we can do this. Let's let 1 million Syrians and others from the Middle East just pour into the country and just welcome them." That was more than the country could digest. You want people who come in as immigrants to want to become, if it's going to Germany, to become German. Come into America, they want to become American. If you have millions of people coming in all at once and you can't digest them, you'll end up with ghettos, you'll end up with social friction, you'll end up with different values, and you'll end up with what he was talking about, which is the kind of crime you're seeing in places like Germany and have ever since Angela Merkel did that. And then the population says, this is a problem, we want to address it. And the major parties say, no, we won't address it. We refuse to. You're bigoted. Turn your eyes away from what you're seeing. Well, you have to expect that other parties, other political factions will rise up and say, we'll take the chore, and people will turn to them. That is just a simple dynamic of politics in the real world. People say, oh, I don't like populism. Populism often means what is popular, and in a democracy, you can't ignore what the people think.
Well, Karp went on to, and not that he is not beset with contradictions. I mean, here's a billionaire who calls himself a socialist, but that's a sort of.
I'm not sure he's still a socialist. I'm not sure that's still the case.
I think
he came from that, but a lot of there were quite a few people like that who did. I look, I could be wrong on this, but I think from what I know of him, there was a very good piece on him in the Wall Street Journal, lead piece in the review section, I think it was last weekend, and he is very much in favor of American values and supporting American values, and that the tech world needs to support American values and interests.
He is, but he was a billionaire when he was still calling himself a socialist, and it's one of those contradictions that only a PhD in philosophy could have. So, yes, he is evolving as much of the tech world is, as Elon Musk has, as so many have. It's been very interesting because of their belief that the West is superior, and they're not afraid to say it, and they were afraid to say it not so long ago. But
exactly, because multiculturalism said you weren't allowed. All cultures are equal, but all cultures are not equal. All cultures haven't achieved the same things. That's just the fact. And if you ignore that and say no, multicultural, that's the slippery slope you find yourself on once you start with this wrong idea of multiculturalism, that there is no difference between, that you cannot say this culture is superior, and then they may not be superior in everything, but they may be superior in some things that are important.
Well, the other thing that he talked about, the two revolutions that are happening, transparency combined with artificial intelligence. And basically, he said, look, so those people that are standing in the way of Elon Musk right now, they are going to get run over. And it's going to change our domestic politics. And the implication clearly is it's going to change geopolitics as well, because those revolutions are not going to be limited to the United States.
All that is true, and artificial intelligence is a revolution that is happening right now. And I think the most important thing from a national security perspective is that the U.S. has to be way in front as leader, because if the Chinese communists are, they will use that to their advantage, and they seek to dominate the world and make America great never again. That is what Xi Jinping intends. And it's very clear. He's made it very clear. We can ignore it if we want to, but that's what Xi Jinping intends. And he is now in a no-limits partnership with Vladimir Putin. And part of this, what I call axis of aggressors, includes Tehran, and the jihadis who live there and rule that country in a terrible way. And, of course, North Korea, where Kim Jong-un also oppresses his people and looks south and thinks, how can I take South Korea over? When can I do that?
So this, speaking of Putin, Zelensky made this statement in the last couple of days that's gotten a lot of circulation because it is an opportunity for the press corps to call into question the Trump administration's approach to Eastern Europe. Zelensky said this.
So I will never accept any decisions between the United States and Russia about Ukraine. Never. And our people, never. And our adults and children and everybody. It can't be so. This is the war in Ukraine against us, and it's our human losses.
I mean, I understand that he has to sort of represent, but I mean, is there any real impetus from the Trump administration to cut a deal with Putin that leaves Zelensky completely out of it and just shove it down his throat? Is that it doesn't seem to me that's the strategy.
I certainly hope it is not. As you know, I wrote a column for the Washington Times. It's in the paper today. It was posted last night. And it outlines an approach that I hope the Trump administration will take because it's consistent with the goals that Trump has articulated, that his deputies have articulated in the past. And what it would end up with is that for sure, Ukraine does not get conquered, does not get absorbed into the Putin's Russian empire. That maybe that perhaps Putin does want, he's not going to say this, but there's evidence, he may want a pause. Why? Because he's running out of tanks, running out of armored vehicles, running out of bodies for cannon fodder. He needs to recruit, he needs to rearm, he needs to get his generals to have a different strategy. He hasn't moved much in the last few months on the ground, and the casualty rate has been enormous. If that were to happen, then what you want to do is help Ukraine get back the deterrent capacity it didn't have, largely because Biden and Obama refused to give lethal weapons, as Trump did. And how can this be paid for? Well, it's very easy how this can be paid for, actually, and Trump has talked about it. Ukraine has untapped natural resources, in particular critical minerals, huge amounts. That untapped natural resource can pay for the weaponry and for other things they need. And what you end up with is a Ukraine that may lose some territory, not de facto. It doesn't have to be recognized. Maybe peacekeepers from European country. Keir Starmer, UK Prime Minister, has actually suggested that's a good idea. And an economic relationship between Ukraine and the U.S. You do not want the critical minerals that Ukraine has going to China after being stolen by Russia following the conquest of Ukraine by Putin. Putin would also use the human resources as well, I believe, to continue to expand his empire, including threatening NATO members, which would put us in a very dangerous situation of either going to war or ending the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, which will mean the end of our Pacific alliances as well. That makes America not great again.
And the question about Ukraine's possible admittance to NATO, I presume, if you can even trust that Putin is negotiating in good faith towards an end and not just negotiating with an eye towards consummating what he attempted at some point in the not too distant future. But if so, he'll assuredly want a commitment that Ukraine will not be invited to join NATO. Should that be a deal breaker for the United States, for Ukraine?
I actually think it's entirely a red herring. If anybody thinks that 3 years ago NATO was a threat to any country, I mean, the German tanks barely ran. There was the U.S. and there were all the European countries that weren't spending or doing anything. NATO was never a threat. What's more, to get into NATO requires that all NATO members, everyone, agree and vote for that. You think Germany was going to do that? There was never a chance in the foreseeable future for Ukraine to join NATO. Now, what this could end up with, as I say in my column, are two things. One, that at the end of the day, Ukraine, like South Korea, is chronically threatened but not imminently threatened because you've got, in this case, I would say European peacekeepers there. Or a little bit like Finland. Finland fought a war against the Soviet Union in 1939 called the Winter War. What was the Soviet Union trying to do? It was trying to drag Finland into the Soviet Union. They resisted. They lost 11% of their territory, but they ended up independent. And what happened 2 years ago? 2 years ago, Finland joined NATO. I think there could be a similar scenario played out here with Ukraine. But it is a red herring that Putin was so scared of NATO. Oh, my God, so scared Ukraine would join NATO. By the way, he has already taken 2 provinces from Georgia. He is influencing hugely the Georgian government. Belarus is next to him, is essentially a vassal state. You got to understand Putin. As you know, I've talked about this with you before. I've studied Putin for 20 years. I've been studying the Soviet Union for over half a century. Putin wants to expand the empire, and this is not a defensive war. He's not addressing the grievance of NATO expansion. That's a red herring. The question
the issue now is not being afraid of Ukraine joining NATO. The issue is if he uses that as a deal breaker and with a hope that the West will blink. Is my question.
Well, what the NATO doesn't want. Here's the problem for NATO. NATO says we are an organization that anybody can apply. We don't recruit. If somebody wants to join, they can apply, and if they qualify, they can apply, and then if every NATO member votes to have them in, they can get in. That's how Finland got in, Sweden got in. Recently, it wasn't so easy. Turkey didn't want to vote for either of them. They eventually got convinced to do so. What you don't want to say is, okay, Russia decides who can apply to NATO and whether or not we will agree. But there was no way prior to this war starting 3 years ago next Monday that Germany, which was getting its natural gas through Nord Stream 1 and building Nord Stream 2 from Russia, was going to vote for that. It wasn't going to happen. So if what Putin is saying is, I want to see you humiliate yourselves. I want to see you agree that I get to decide what NATO does and doesn't do. That's hard to do. But de facto, Ukraine's not going into NATO anytime soon. It never was. That's not the point. The point is whether Ukraine retains its independence or not. And by the way, it could not go into NATO. Could it go into the European Union? Maybe that's for the European Union to decide. The question is, do independent nations, members of the UN, get to make decisions? Or does Putin get to say, hey, I get to make these decisions, and you all say, of course, sir, we understand. You're the czar.
Well, what should Trump's role be in all of this? Because the president's saying that he's going to probably meet with Putin sometime next month.
Yeah, he should meet with Putin and say, here's what I think you need. You need a pause in this war. And if you can get that pause. And you need to show better behavior. One is you invaded a neighboring country. You've committed terrible war crimes. You've targeted hospitals. You've targeted schools. You've stolen thousands of children to brainwash them and bring them up as Russian. You've got to back down off of this. And if you do, look, quietly, you'll keep Crimea. I understand you want Crimea. It's a naval base. It's important. Maybe we're going to turn a blind eye to keeping certain territories in the eastern part of Ukraine. But you're not going to take over the whole country, and we're not going to let you do that. But we can relieve sanctions for you, and you can find a way back into the G7, which can again become the G8. And we'd like to see you normalize. But you have to do some things. This is not for us to make concessions to you after you've committed war crimes for 3 years.
Cliff May, president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, foreign affairs columnist for the Washington Times. Cliff, thank you as always.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer.